I was placing 70 candles on my birthday cake when I heard voices from the backyard. The afternoon sun streamed through Robert's favorite lace curtains, and everything felt perfect for my celebration. Sarah and David had arrived early with the grandchildren, and Mark would join us soon. At 70, I'd learned to treasure these family moments. As I reached for my mother's silver spoons, David's voice drifted through the open window. But something made me freeze. This wasn't the warm voice that had called me Mom for 12 years, or comforted me at Robert's funeral. This voice was cold, calculating. Why did we even invite the old woman? David was saying. She just gets in the way of our real family. Honestly, it would be better if she just disappeared. Then we could finally have everything that's hers. The silver spoons slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor, the sound echoing through my suddenly silent kitchen. For a moment, I thought I must have misheard. This couldn't be David, my son-in-law who brought me flowers every Mother's Day, who helped me with my computer problems, who had tears in his eyes when he thanked me for lending him and Sarah the down payment for their house 3 years ago. But then I heard Sarah's voice, quieter but unmistakably hers. David, keep your voice down. She might hear you. There was no outrage in her tone, no defense of her mother. Just caution, just concern about being overheard. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story from. I need to share this with you because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my family. My legs felt weak, and I gripped the edge of the counter as their conversation continued. David laughed. A sound I'd heard countless times across my dinner table, but now it sounded like acid in my ears. She's probably half deaf anyway, and even if she heard, who would believe her? We've been so good to her, so helpful. Everyone thinks we're the perfect family. I stood there in my own kitchen, in the house where I'd raised my children, where I'd mourned my husband, where I'd believed I was surrounded by love, and felt my world crumble around me. The birthday dress I'd chosen so carefully that morning suddenly felt like a costume for a play I didn't know I was performing in. The careful makeup I'd applied, hoping to look vibrant and happy for my family photos, now felt like war paint for a battle I didn't know I was fighting. At 70 years old, standing in my kitchen with 70 candles waiting to be lit, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. And in that moment of devastating clarity, I knew that this birthday would mark not just another year of my life, but the beginning of a war I never saw coming. The voices outside were discussing practical matters now, something about timing and opportunities, but I could no longer focus on the words. My mind was reeling, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd just discovered. The man I'd trusted with my daughter's happiness, the man I'd welcomed into my family with open arms, the man to whom I'd given financial help, emotional support, and unconditional love, saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. I thought about all the times David had asked innocent questions about my health, my medications, my plans for the future. All the times he'd offered to help with my banking, my insurance, my legal documents. All the conversations about how lonely I must be in this big house, how difficult it must be to maintain, how maybe I should consider something smaller, more manageable. Now, with horrible clarity, I understood that none of it had been innocent at all. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone, instinctively wanting to call someone, to tell someone what I'd heard. But who? Mark was my youngest, and while I loved him dearly, he'd always been easily influenced, especially by his older sister. Sarah herself was clearly involved in whatever this was. And my closest friends? Would they believe that the charming, helpful David they'd come to know over the years was capable of such cruelty? The birthday cake sat before me, cheerful and innocent, decorated with pink roses and gold trim. "Happy 70th birthday, Mom," was written in flowing script across the top. Sarah had ordered it from my favorite bakery, the one that had made all our family celebration cakes for years. Even this gesture, which I'd seen as love and thoughtfulness just an hour ago, now felt tainted. Was it just part of the performance? Part of maintaining the facade while they planned my downfall? I heard footsteps on the back porch, and panic shot through me. They were coming back inside. I quickly turned away from the window and busied myself with unnecessary adjustments to the table settings, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they'd be able to hear it. When the kitchen door opened and David walked in with his usual warm smile, I had to grip the back of a chair to steady myself. "How's the birthday girl doing?" he asked, his voice now filled with the affection I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Everything looks perfect, Mom. You've really outdone yourself." He moved to hug me, the same gesture he'd made hundreds of times before, but now I had to fight every instinct not to recoil from his touch. This was the beginning of my education in the art of deception, though I didn't know it yet. As David's arms encircled me in what I now knew was a false embrace, as I felt his kiss on my cheek and heard his words of celebration, I began to understand that I was living in a performance where everyone knew their lines except me. The worst part wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the realization that I'd been the unwitting star of this show for who knows how long, believing in a reality that existed only in my own mind. Looking back now, I understand that moment in my kitchen wasn't just the end of my innocence about my family. It was the birth of something else entirely, a steel-hard determination that would surprise everyone, including myself. Because David had made one crucial mistake in his calculation. He'd assumed that a 70-year-old widow would be helpless, confused, and easily manipulated. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. Before I became Margaret Fletcher, the vulnerable widow that David thought he could manipulate, I was Margaret Sullivan, and my life had been anything but easy. I grew up during a time when women had to be strong to survive, when families worked together not out of obligation but out of necessity, and when respect for elders wasn't just a nice idea, but a fundamental value that held communities together. My parents, Irish immigrants who'd built their life from nothing, taught me that family was everything, but they also taught me to recognize the difference between love and exploitation. When I married Robert Fletcher 48 years ago, I thought I'd found my fairy tale. Robert was a gentle man, a high school principal who believed in education, hard work, and treating everyone with dignity. We were that couple that people pointed to as an example of what marriage should be. We built our life together brick by brick, literally. Robert would come home from school and we'd work on our house together, installing the kitchen cabinets with our own hands, painting each room with care, planning every detail of the garden that would eventually become the envy of our neighborhood. We were blessed with Sarah first, and then Mark 3 years later. I remember thinking that our family was perfect, complete. I threw myself into motherhood with the same intensity I'd brought to everything else in my life. I baked birthday cakes from scratch, sewed Halloween costumes by hand, organized school fundraisers, coached Little League, and made sure our home was the place where all the neighborhood children wanted to spend their time. Robert used to joke that I was running a small hotel, but he said it with pride. Our house was full of laughter, chaos, and unconditional love. When Sarah brought David home for the first time 12 years ago, I was thrilled. My daughter was 34 and had been through a series of relationships that never seemed to develop into anything serious. She was successful in her career as a marketing executive, but I worried about her happiness, her fulfillment as a woman. When I saw how David looked at her, how he listened when she spoke, how he made her laugh, I thought my prayers had been answered. David was everything a mother could want for her daughter. He was handsome, certainly, with his dark hair and warm brown eyes, but more importantly, he was respectful. He called me Mrs. Fletcher until I insisted he call me Mom. He asked Robert's permission before proposing to Sarah, a gesture that brought tears to my husband's eyes. He was ambitious in his career in real estate, but not in a way that seemed greedy or selfish. He talked about wanting to provide for Sarah, about building a family, about creating the kind of stable home life that would honor the example Robert and I had set. The wedding was everything we'd dreamed of for Sarah. David insisted on paying for most of it himself, despite our offers to help, because he wanted to start our marriage by taking care of my new family. I remember dancing with him at the reception, looking into his eyes and telling him how grateful I was that he was now my son. He held me close and said, "Mom, you raised the most incredible woman in the world. I promise I'll spend my life making her as happy as you and Dad did." Those early years of their marriage were golden. Emma was born 2 years later, and Jake followed 18 months after that. I was the proudest grandmother in the world, and David made sure I was involved in every aspect of the children's lives. He'd bring them over for Sunday dinners, encourage them to spend weekends with Grandma, and always made sure I was included in their important milestones. When Emma took her first steps, it was in my living room. When Jake said his first word, it was Grandma. David made sure I knew I was loved and needed. When Robert was diagnosed with cancer 6 years ago, David was incredible. He took time off work to drive us to medical appointments. He researched treatments, found the best doctors, and sat with me in hospital waiting rooms for hours. When Robert's condition worsened, David was the one who convinced me to hire hospice care, the one who helped me understand that sometimes loving someone means letting them go. At Robert's funeral, David was a pallbearer, and when he hugged me at the gravesite, I genuinely felt like I was losing a husband, but still had a son who would take care of me. Over the years, I'd given them so much, but it never felt like sacrifice. When they needed the down payment for their house, I liquidated some of Robert's retirement investments without hesitation. $47,000 felt like nothing compared to seeing my daughter and grandchildren happy and secure. When David's real estate business hit a rough patch during the recession, I helped with their mortgage payments for 6 months, about $12,000 total. When Emma needed expensive orthodontic work last year, I paid the $7,000 bill gladly. But it wasn't just about money. I babysat the children whenever they needed, sometimes for entire weekends. I cooked family dinners every Sunday, providing not just the meal but the groceries as well. I helped with school projects, birthday parties, and holiday celebrations. When Sarah got the flu 2 winters ago, I moved into their house for a week to take care of everyone. When David's mother died 3 years ago, I was the one who helped plan the funeral, made the arrangements, and supported him through his grief as if he were my own son. My house became their second home. I kept toys in my living room, children's books in every bedroom, and their favorite snacks always stocked in my pantry. I maintained a college fund for both children, contributing $500 every month since they were born. I made sure they understood their family history, showed them pictures of their great-grandparents, taught them the family recipes that had been passed down for generations. The house itself was our greatest achievement. Robert and I had bought it for $32,000 in 1979, when the neighborhood was just starting to develop. Over the years, we'd renovated every room, added a screened porch, landscaped the grounds, and turned it into something that was now worth close to $800,000. The life insurance money from Robert's death, combined with his pension and our savings, meant that I was comfortable financially. Not wealthy, but secure enough to be generous with my family and still maintain my independence. I thought I was living the perfect widow's life. I had my health, my financial security, my beautiful home, and most importantly, my loving family. Every night, I'd thank God for the blessings in my life. Every morning, I'd wake up grateful for another day to spend with the people I loved most. I volunteered at the church, maintained my garden, played bridge with my friends on Thursday afternoons, and looked forward to every family gathering. David had been so attentive to my needs, always asking about my health, my plans, my concerns for the future. Just last month, he'd spent an entire evening helping me organize my important documents, explaining how he'd made digital copies of everything, just in case something happens. He'd helped me update my will 2 years ago, making sure that Sarah and Mark were provided for, but also ensuring that Emma and Jake would have their college educations guaranteed. He'd even suggested that I make him a backup on my financial accounts, just so someone can help you if you ever get confused about anything. Looking back now, I realize that every conversation about my vulnerability, every offer to help, every suggestion about my future care had been part of a carefully orchestrated plan. The man I'd trusted to protect me had been systematically gathering information, access, and control. The son-in-law I'd loved like my own child had been studying my weaknesses, calculating my worth, and planning for my elimination. But in those days before my 70th birthday, I believed in the fairy tale we'd created together. I believed that I was surrounded by people who loved me, that my generosity had been appreciated and returned with genuine affection, that my golden years would be spent watching my grandchildren grow up while being supported by a family that valued my presence in their lives. Standing in my kitchen on my birthday morning, still reeling from what I'd overheard, I realized that the fairy tale had been real for me, but not for everyone else. I'd been living in a beautiful story while others had been calculating the value of my assets, my life insurance policies, and my real estate. The love I'd given freely had been returned with performance and patience, waiting for the right moment to cash in on their investment. The hardest part wasn't even the betrayal itself. The hardest part was realizing that I'd been such a fool. But as I stood there in that kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of my shattered illusions, something else began to grow alongside my heartbreak. Because while David had been studying me, learning my routines and my vulnerabilities, he'd missed something crucial about the woman he thought he could manipulate. He'd seen the gentle grandmother, the generous mother-in-law, the grieving widow who needed his protection and guidance. But he'd failed to recognize the strong woman who'd built a life from nothing, who'd survived loss and hardship, who'd raised 2 children essentially on her own while Robert worked long hours, and who'd managed a household, investments, and family dynamics for decades. David thought he was dealing with a helpless old woman. He was about to learn that he'd awakened something far more dangerous. A mother protecting her legacy, her dignity, and her family's future. The first sign that something wasn't right had actually come months before my birthday, but I dismissed it as nothing more than generational misunderstanding. It was during one of our regular Sunday dinners, when David had made an offhand comment about how complicated my finances must be getting as I got older. He'd suggested, with what seemed like genuine concern, that managing investments and banking at my age must be overwhelming, and that maybe it was time to simplify things. At the time, I'd laughed it off, explaining that I'd been managing our family's finances for 50 years and felt quite capable of continuing. But David had persisted, gently suggesting that mistakes happen when we get older, and that it might be safer to have someone younger helping with the complex stuff. When I'd politely declined his offer to take over my financial management, I'd noticed a flicker of something across his face. Disappointment? Frustration? But it had passed so quickly that I'd convinced myself I'd imagined it. Over the following weeks, I'd started noticing other small things that hadn't quite felt right. David had begun asking very specific questions about my insurance policies, questions that seemed oddly detailed for casual conversation. He'd inquire about the exact amount of my life insurance, whether I'd updated my beneficiaries recently, and whether I understood all the fine print in my policies. When I'd mentioned that everything was properly handled by my insurance agent of 20 years, David had suggested that maybe I needed a second opinion from someone more current with modern policies. There were the comments about my house, too. David had always complimented my home, but recently his observations had taken on a different tone. He'd started pointing out maintenance issues, the roof that would probably need replacing soon, the heating system that was getting pretty old, the foundation that might be developing problems. When I'd mentioned that I'd had the house professionally inspected just 2 years ago and everything was fine, David had smiled and said, "Well, things can change quickly in houses this age. You might want to get another inspection, just to be safe." But it was the conversations about my future living arrangements that had really started to bother me, though I hadn't consciously recognized why at the time. David had begun bringing up stories about elderly people he knew who'd struggled to maintain their independence in houses that were too big for them. He'd mention assisted living facilities he'd seen, always describing them in glowing terms as places where seniors can get the help they need while still maintaining their dignity. When I'd firmly stated that I intended to live in my home for as long as possible, David had responded with what seemed like understanding, but had then begun a subtle campaign of undermining my confidence. He'd point out times when I forgot small things, suggesting they might be signs of normal aging that I should keep an eye on. When I'd misplace my keys or forget a phone number, David would make gentle comments about how these things happen to everyone as they get older, but that it was important to recognize when help is needed. The most disturbing pattern, which I'd completely missed until after my birthday revelation, was how David had been gradually positioning himself as my primary support system. He'd started scheduling his visits for times when Mark couldn't be there, effectively becoming my main point of contact with Sarah's side of the family. He'd volunteer to handle things like scheduling maintenance for my house, dealing with service providers, and even picking up my prescriptions when I was perfectly capable of doing these things myself. What I'd interpreted as kindness and helpfulness, I now realized, had been a systematic effort to make me dependent on him while gathering information about every aspect of my life. David had been learning my routines, my weaknesses, my financial situation, and my support network, all while positioning himself as indispensable to my daily functioning. The medication incident should have been a huge red flag, but I'd explained it away at the time. About 6 weeks before my birthday, I'd started feeling unusually tired and confused in the afternoons. My doctor had adjusted my blood pressure medication, suggesting that the dosage might be too high, but I'd continued to feel foggy and disoriented at times. David had been particularly attentive during this period, often stopping by in the afternoons to check on me and make sure I was taking my medications correctly. One afternoon, when I'd been feeling particularly muddled, David had helped me organize my pill organizer, explaining that he wanted to make sure I didn't accidentally double dose on anything. He'd been so careful, so thorough, reading each label and making sure every pill was in the right compartment. At the time, I'd been grateful for his help and had attributed my improved mental clarity in the following weeks to his organizational skills. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and a clear understanding of David's true intentions, I wondered if my confusion had been as accidental as I'd assumed. I remembered that David had been the one to suggest the medication review to my doctor, claiming he'd noticed me, seeming a bit forgetful. He'd also been present at that appointment, answering questions about my behavior and symptoms that I would have answered differently. The financial irregularities had been subtle but consistent. Small amounts missing from my checking account, $20 here, $50 there, always with explanations that made sense at the time. David had mentioned borrowing small amounts for lunch when he'd forgotten his wallet, or picking up groceries for me and rounding up the reimbursement to cover gas. Individually, these incidents had seemed insignificant, but they'd been happening regularly for months. More concerning were the documents that had gone missing and then mysteriously reappeared. My homeowner's insurance policy had disappeared from my file cabinet, only to turn up a week later in a kitchen drawer where I never would have put it. David had found it and had suggested that maybe I should keep important documents somewhere more organized. He'd volunteered to help me set up a filing system, and I'd been touched by his willingness to spend time on such a tedious task. Bank statements had started arriving late or not at all, and when I'd called to inquire, I'd been told that my address had been updated in their system, though I'd never made such a change. David had been with me when I'd called to correct the address, and he'd been very helpful in dealing with the customer service representative, even taking the phone to explain the situation more clearly. There had been the mysterious visitors, too, people claiming to be from various companies, insurance adjusters, home inspection services, financial planning firms, who had shown up at my door claiming they were following up on requests I'd never made. When I'd explained that I hadn't contacted them, they'd always said there must have been a misunderstanding and left without any fuss. At the time, I'd attributed these incidents to corporate marketing mistakes or clerical errors, but the most chilling thing, looking back, was how David had been gradually isolating me from my support network. He'd started expressing concern about my friend Martha, suggesting that she was getting pretty forgetful herself, and maybe wasn't the best influence on me. When my neighbor Ben had offered to help with some yard work, David had intercepted the conversation and explained that he preferred to handle those things for me, to make sure I wasn't taken advantage of. Even my relationship with Mark had been subtly influenced by David's interventions. When Mark would call to make plans with me, David would often mention that I'd been having a tough week or was feeling a bit overwhelmed, suggesting that maybe Mark should postpone his visit. When Mark would insist on coming anyway, David would often arrange to be there too, effectively supervising our interactions and steering conversations away from topics he didn't want discussed. The most insidious part of David's manipulation was how he'd been using my own generosity against me. Every time I'd given money to help with their expenses, David had made a point of discussing my limited income and how I needed to be more careful with my spending. He'd express guilt about accepting my help, while simultaneously calculating exactly how much I could afford to give. He'd been keeping careful track of every dollar I'd contributed to their family while building a case for why I needed financial guidance. What I'd mistaken for love and concern had been systematic preparation for something I'd never even imagined possible. David hadn't just been planning to wait for my natural death to inherit whatever I might leave behind. He'd been actively working to accelerate the timeline, to position himself as my guardian and controller, and to maximize his access to my assets while minimizing my independence and decision-making capacity. Standing in my kitchen on my birthday, finally understanding the true nature of the man I'd trusted with my family's future, I realized that my instincts had been trying to warn me for months. Every uncomfortable feeling, every moment of confusion, every incident that had seemed slightly off had been my subconscious mind recognizing a pattern that my conscious mind had refused to see. But now I saw everything clearly. And I was about to make sure that David's careful planning would backfire in ways he'd never anticipated. The investigation that followed my birthday revelation became the most intense and systematic project of my life. For decades, I'd applied my organizational skills to managing a household, planning family events, and maintaining our finances. Now, I channeled those same abilities into uncovering the full extent of David's deception and protecting myself from further manipulation. I started by reviewing every financial document I could find, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. Over the past 2 years, there had been numerous small withdrawals from my accounts that I'd either forgotten about or had accepted David's explanations for at the time. But seeing them all together, the pattern was unmistakable. $25 here, $60 there, sometimes as much as $200. Always amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but totaling more than $3,000 over the past year alone. More disturbing were the changes to my account settings that I'd never authorized. My bank statements were being sent to a secondary address, a post office box I'd never opened. My online banking password had been changed multiple times, always with explanations from David about security improvements he'd helped me implement. When I called the bank to inquire about these changes, I learned that someone with access to my social security number and account information had been calling regularly, asking about my balances, transaction histories, and account security features. The most chilling discovery came when I examined my insurance policies. My life insurance beneficiaries had been updated 8 months ago, with Sarah and David listed as primary beneficiaries and Mark moved to secondary status. I'd never made this change, and when I compared the signature on the modification form to my actual handwriting, the differences were obvious. Someone had been practicing forging my signature, and they'd gotten good enough to fool a casual review. My homeowner's insurance had been modified as well, with David added as an interested party, who would be notified of any changes to the policy and would receive copies of all correspondence. This gave him access to information about the property's value, any claims I might file, and advance notice of any coverage changes. He'd also requested detailed appraisals of the house's contents, claiming it was for estate planning purposes. But perhaps the most sophisticated part of David's plan involved my medical care. I discovered that he'd been in contact with my doctor's office, identifying himself as my primary caregiver and requesting to be included in all communications about my health. He'd provided them with his contact information as my emergency contact, displacing Mark without my knowledge. Most disturbingly, he'd been reporting concerns about my mental state, suggesting that I was becoming forgetful and might need assistance managing my medications and medical decisions. When I called my doctor's office to clarify these arrangements, I learned that David had scheduled an appointment for me to discuss cognitive evaluation, and had requested information about power of attorney procedures for elderly patients who might be developing dementia. The appointment was scheduled for the week after my birthday, the timing now seeming obviously calculated rather than coincidental. I spent hours going through old emails, text messages, and voicemails, looking for evidence of David's true intentions. What I found was a masterclass in manipulation. In written communications, David was always careful to use language that seemed caring and appropriate, but the subtext was consistently about access, control, and financial information. He'd ask about my peace of mind regarding my financial security, while requesting specific details about my investment portfolios. He'd express concern about my safety, while gathering information about my daily routines and when I was most likely to be alone. The most damaging evidence came from my computer's browsing history. David had been using my computer during his visits and had forgotten to delete his search history. I found extensive research about inheritance laws, estate planning, elder abuse statutes, and most disturbingly, information about how to establish guardianship over an elderly person deemed mentally incompetent. He'd been studying the legal processes for taking control of an older person's finances and medical decisions, clearly preparing for a future where I would be declared unable to care for myself. But David's research had also revealed his weaknesses. He'd been sloppy about covering his digital tracks, and I found evidence of communications between him and Sarah about the timeline and making sure everything is in place. There were emails discussing my confused behavior and speculating about how much longer I could safely live alone. Most damning were messages where they discussed specific dollar amounts, the value of my house, my investment accounts, and my life insurance policies. I discovered that David had been photographing documents during his visits to my home, taking pictures of bank statements, insurance policies, and legal documents with his phone. He'd compiled a comprehensive file of my financial information, probably stored somewhere I'd never think to look. He knew exactly what I was worth, down to the penny, and had been tracking my spending patterns to project how long my assets would last. The scope of his preparation was breathtaking in its thoroughness and terrifying in its implications. David hadn't just been planning to wait for my death. He'd been laying the groundwork to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could assume control of my finances while I was still alive. Once he had legal guardianship, he could make decisions about my living arrangements, my medical care, and my finances without my input or consent. I realized that my growing confusion about medications hadn't been accidental at all. David had been systematically interfering with my prescriptions, sometimes doubling doses to make me appear more confused, other times skipping doses to create symptoms that would support his claims about my declining mental state. The afternoon visits when I'd felt particularly foggy had coincided perfectly with times when David had helped with my medication management. But as I uncovered the full extent of David's betrayal, I also began to understand Sarah's role in the conspiracy. She hadn't been an innocent victim of her husband's manipulation. She'd been an active participant. I found evidence of their joint planning, their shared calculations about my worth, and their coordinated efforts to document my supposed mental decline. Sarah had been reporting our conversations to David, providing him with information about my concerns, my plans, and my relationships with other family members. The revelation about Sarah's involvement was perhaps the most heartbreaking part of my investigation. I'd expected betrayal from David. He was, after all, someone who'd married into our family and might have always seen us as a means to an end. But Sarah was my daughter, the child I'd raised, sacrificed for, and loved unconditionally. Her willingness to participate in David's scheme felt like a knife in my heart. Yet as I processed this betrayal, I also began to feel something else, a cold, calculated anger that surprised me with its intensity. These people had underestimated me completely. They'd seen a lonely widow and assumed I was helpless. They'd mistaken my generosity for gullibility, my love for weakness and my trust for stupidity. But I'd spent 70 years learning how to survive, how to protect what mattered to me, and how to fight for my family when necessary. David and Sarah had made the mistake of thinking that being older meant being vulnerable. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. As I compiled my evidence and planned my response, I realized that this investigation had taught me something important about myself. I wasn't the fragile, dependent woman they'd been gradually manipulating me into becoming. I was still the same person who'd built a life from nothing, who'd raised 2 children, who'd managed a household and finances for decades, and who'd survived the loss of my life partner while maintaining my independence and dignity. David had awakened a part of me that I'd forgotten existed, the fierce protector who would do whatever it took to defend what was mine. The moment of final revelation came exactly 1 week after my birthday, during what should have been a routine family dinner. I'd spent that week carefully planning, gathering evidence, and preparing for what I knew would be the most important conversation of my life. I'd also made some strategic phone calls to my lawyer, my financial advisor, and my doctor, setting in motion protections that David couldn't possibly have anticipated. When Sarah and David arrived that Sunday evening with Emma and Jake, everything seemed perfectly normal. David hugged me with his usual warmth, complimented the dinner I'd prepared, and played with the children in the living room while Sarah helped me in the kitchen. But I was watching everything through new eyes, noting how David's attention kept drifting to the mail on my counter, how he casually asked about my week's activities, and how he made subtle inquiries about whether I'd had any visitors or phone calls. After dinner, when the children were absorbed in a movie in the family room, I suggested that the adults sit on the screened porch for coffee and dessert. It was a beautiful evening, and the setting felt appropriately peaceful for what I was about to unleash. As we settled into the wicker chairs where we'd shared so many pleasant conversations over the years, I took a deep breath and began. "David," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation from last week, the one you had in my backyard during my birthday party." The change in David's expression was immediate and dramatic. The relaxed smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of confusion that quickly shifted to alarm. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mom. What conversation?" "The one where you said it would be better if I just disappeared so you could have everything that's mine," I continued, watching as the color drained from his face. "The one where you called me the old woman and talked about how I just get in the way of your family." Sarah's coffee cup clattered against the saucer, and her face went white. "Mom, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, Sarah," I said, turning to look at my daughter with a calmness that surprised even me. "I heard every word. I heard you tell David to keep his voice down because I might hear him. I heard you both discuss your timeline and your plans. And since then, I've discovered just how extensive those plans really are." David recovered his composure first, switching to the concerned, caring tone I now recognized as his primary manipulation tool. "Mom, I think you might have misunderstood something. Maybe you heard part of a conversation out of context, or perhaps I'm getting confused because of my age," I interrupted. "Perhaps I'm having those cognitive issues you've been so concerned about. The ones you've been discussing with my doctor without my knowledge." The silence that followed was deafening. David and Sarah exchanged a look that confirmed everything I'd suspected about their coordination and planning. When David spoke again, his voice had lost some of its false warmth. "Look, if you think you heard something that upset you, we should talk about it. But maybe we're all getting a little emotional here. Why don't we discuss this when everyone's had time to calm down?" "I am calm, David. I'm probably calmer than I've been in months, now that I finally understand what's been happening in my own home." I reached into the folder I'd placed beside my chair and pulled out the first document. "Let's start with these bank records. Can you explain these withdrawals you've been making from my accounts?" I watched David's face as I laid out the evidence I'd compiled. The forged signature on my insurance beneficiary change, the unauthorized modifications to my banking information, the medical conversations he'd had behind my back, the research he'd conducted about establishing guardianship over elderly relatives. With each piece of evidence, David's attempts at explanation became more desperate and less convincing. Sarah sat in stunned silence, occasionally starting to speak but then stopping herself, clearly realizing that anything she said would only make things worse. "The most interesting thing I discovered," I continued, "was your research into power of attorney procedures and guardianship laws. It seems you've been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, so you could take control of my finances. That's quite an ambitious project, David." That's not— I was just trying to understand how to help you if you ever needed it, David stammered. I wanted to be prepared in case something happened to you. How thoughtful. And I suppose the medication tampering was also about helping me, making me confused and disoriented so you'd have evidence of my declining mental state. This accusation hit its mark perfectly. David's face went from pale to flushed, and for the first time, I saw real anger flash in his eyes. You can't prove any of that. You're making accusations that— That what, David? That could get you arrested for elder abuse? For fraud? For forgery? I smiled calmly at him. You're right that I need to be careful about making accusations I can't prove. That's why I've spent the week documenting everything and consulting with the appropriate professionals. I pulled out my phone and played a recording I'd made during one of David's visits the previous week, when he'd thought I was napping in my bedroom. His voice came through clearly as he spoke on the phone to someone, discussing the old lady's assets and speculating about how much longer we have to wait. The sound of his own voice, recorded in my own home, saying the things he'd thought I'd never hear, broke David's remaining composure. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee cup and sending the contents spilling across the glass-topped table. You've been recording private conversations in your own home. That's invasion of privacy. In my own home, David? Protecting myself from theft and fraud in my own home is invasion of privacy? I remained seated, my voice level and controlled. I think you're confused about who the victim is here. Sarah finally found her voice, but what came out wasn't an apology or an explanation. Instead, it was anger. Mom, do you have any idea what you're doing? You're destroying our family over some misunderstanding. David loves you. We all love you. How can you even think we'd hurt you? Sarah, sweetheart, I said, looking at my daughter with a mixture of sadness and determination. I'm not destroying our family. You and David already did that when you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Through the family room doorway, I could hear Emma and Jake laughing at their movie, completely unaware that their family was imploding just a few feet away. The contrast between their innocent joy and the ugly reality of adult betrayal made the moment even more surreal. David made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. Look, even if there have been some misunderstandings, we're family. We can work this out. There's no need to involve lawyers or anyone else. We love you, Mom, and we want what's best for you. I stood up slowly, gathering my documents and looking at David with an expression I'm sure he'd never seen from me before. What's best for me, David, is never seeing either of you again. What's best for me is making sure you never have access to my money, my home, or my grandchildren without supervision. What's best for me is ensuring that your little plan never works on anyone else. As I spoke, I saw David's mask finally slip completely. The caring, concerned son-in-law disappeared, replaced by someone I barely recognized. His voice turned cold and calculating. You're making a big mistake, old woman. You need us more than you realize. Who's going to take care of you when you can't take care of yourself? Who's going to visit you when you're sick and alone? You're 70 years old, and you're about to find out exactly how lonely the world can be. The transformation was so complete, so chilling, that for a moment I felt a flicker of the fear David had been counting on all along. But then I looked at my daughter, my own child, nodding in agreement with her husband's threats, and my fear turned to something much stronger. David, I said quietly, you just made this much easier for me, because now I don't have to feel guilty about what I'm going to do to you. The aftermath of that confrontation moved with a swiftness that surprised everyone, including myself. Within 24 hours of that Sunday evening revelation, I had activated a plan that I'd been developing throughout my week of investigation. My lawyer, who had been quietly preparing documentation for the past several days, filed for restraining orders against both David and Sarah, citing elder abuse, financial fraud, and identity theft. The restraining orders were temporary initially, but they effectively barred David and Sarah from my property, my financial institutions, and any contact with me except through legal representation. More importantly, they triggered automatic investigations by both the police and the state's elder abuse unit, who had been waiting for my signal to begin their own inquiry into David's activities. The children were the most complicated part of the immediate aftermath. Emma and Jake had been at my house when I'd confronted their parents, and they'd witnessed the angry departure that followed. While they didn't understand the adult complexities of what had happened, they knew that Grandma and Mommy and Daddy were fighting, and that they might not be coming back to Grandma's house anymore. Mark arrived within hours of Sarah and David's departure. Summoned by my phone call, and clearly shaken by what I'd told him about his sister's involvement in David's scheme, his initial reaction was disbelief. Sarah was his older sister, the one who'd helped raise him, the one he'd always looked up to. But as I showed him the evidence I'd compiled, I watched his shock transform into anger, and then into a protective determination that reminded me so much of his father. "Mom, I had no idea," he kept repeating, looking through the bank records and forged documents. "I knew David asked a lot of questions about your finances, but I thought he was just trying to be helpful. And Sarah, I can't believe Sarah would be part of this." But Mark's disbelief didn't extend to blind loyalty. Within days, he'd become my strongest ally and advocate, helping me navigate the legal processes and serving as a buffer between me and the chaos that David and Sarah were trying to create in response to my actions. The financial protection measures we implemented were comprehensive and immediate. Every account David had ever had access to was closed and reopened with new numbers and security protocols. All of my insurance policies were reviewed and corrected, with forged signatures reported to the insurance companies and police. My lawyer arranged for a comprehensive financial audit to determine exactly how much money David had stolen over the years, and we discovered that the amount was significantly higher than my initial calculations had suggested. But the most important step was updating my will and all related legal documents. David and Sarah were completely removed from any inheritance, any decision-making authority, and any access to information about my estate. Mark was designated as my primary beneficiary and legal representative, but with specific provisions that protected Emma and Jake's inheritance through trusts that couldn't be touched by their parents. The legal consequences for David began almost immediately. The police investigation uncovered additional evidence of his fraud, including digital communications that clearly showed his intent to manipulate and steal from me. The forged insurance documents alone constituted multiple felonies, but the systematic nature of his scheme qualified for additional charges under elder abuse statutes that carried enhanced penalties. Sarah's involvement made her legally vulnerable as well, though her role had been more supportive than active. She faced charges related to conspiracy and fraud, but her lawyer was negotiating for reduced penalties in exchange for her cooperation in the investigation against David. This cooperation requirement meant that Sarah had to provide testimony about David's planning and methods, effectively ending any possibility of their marriage surviving the legal process. The social consequences were perhaps even more devastating for David than the legal ones. Word of his scheme spread quickly through our community, and his real estate business collapsed almost overnight. Clients canceled contracts, colleagues distanced themselves, and his professional reputation was destroyed completely. The man who had built his career on trust and relationship building found himself unemployable in a field that depended entirely on personal credibility. For Sarah, the consequences were more complex but equally life-changing. Her marketing career survived initially, but the stress of the legal proceedings and the dissolution of her marriage created problems that affected her work performance. More significantly, her relationship with Emma and Jake became strained as they struggled to understand why Mommy and Daddy were always angry, why they couldn't see Grandma anymore, and why their family was falling apart. The custody arrangements for the children became a battleground that revealed just how far David's manipulation had extended. During the divorce proceedings, evidence emerged that David had been planning to use the children as additional leverage against me, threatening to limit my access to them if I didn't comply with his financial demands. This revelation influenced the court's custody decision significantly, resulting in Mark being granted supervised visitation rights with the children and authority to facilitate their relationship with me. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was watching David's carefully constructed facade crumble in public. The charming, helpful son-in-law who had fooled so many people for so many years was exposed as a calculating manipulator who had targeted a vulnerable widow for financial gain. The contrast between his public persona and his revealed character was so stark that people who had known him for years began questioning everything they thought they'd understood about him. The community response was overwhelmingly supportive of my decision to pursue legal action. Other elderly residents came forward with their own stories of David's inappropriate questions about their finances and living situations, suggesting that I might not have been his only intended victim. The investigation expanded to examine whether David had been running similar schemes against other elderly clients in his real estate business. My own transformation during this period surprised everyone, including myself. The confused, vulnerable woman that David had been carefully cultivating disappeared, replaced by someone who was sharp, decisive, and absolutely ruthless in protecting what was mine. Friends and neighbors commented on how much more energetic and focused I seemed, as if removing David's influence had lifted a fog that had been clouding my judgment for months. The medication issues resolved themselves almost immediately once I took control of my own prescription management. The afternoon confusion and disorientation that had been troubling me disappeared completely, confirming my suspicions about David's interference. My doctor was appalled when I explained what had been happening, and immediately reported David's unauthorized involvement in my medical care to the appropriate authorities. But the most important outcome of this entire process was the protection it provided for future victims. David's methods were thoroughly documented during the investigation, creating a case study that law enforcement and elder protection services could use to identify similar schemes. His conviction would serve as a deterrent to others who might consider targeting elderly individuals for financial manipulation. As the immediate crisis phase passed and the legal processes moved forward, I began to understand that my confrontation with David had been about more than just stopping his scheme. It had been about reclaiming my identity, my independence, and my right to make decisions about my own life. David had been gradually stripping away my autonomy, making me dependent on his assistance and guidance, preparing me to accept his control over my life. By fighting back, I'd not only protected my assets, but had also preserved my dignity and self-determination. Looking back at those chaotic weeks following my 70th birthday, I realized that David had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd assumed that my age made me weak, that my loneliness made me desperate, and that my generosity made me gullible. But he'd failed to understand that all of those characteristics could also be sources of strength when properly directed. My age had given me experience in recognizing patterns and solving problems. My loneliness had made me value genuine relationships and recognize false ones. And my generosity had taught me to fight fiercely for the people and things I truly loved. David had awakened something in me that he'd never expected to face. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The strategy I developed for dealing with David's betrayal was methodical, comprehensive, and designed to ensure that he would never be able to harm another elderly person the way he'd tried to harm me. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, protection, and sending a clear message that targeting vulnerable older adults would have serious consequences. The financial warfare began with asset protection measures that were both immediate and permanent. Working with my financial advisor and attorney, we created a complex trust structure that shielded my wealth from any future attempts at manipulation or fraud. My house was transferred into an irrevocable trust with Mark as the trustee, ensuring that even if someone successfully challenged my mental competency in the future, they couldn't gain access to my primary asset. My liquid assets were similarly protected through multiple accounts at different institutions, each with its own security protocols and access requirements. The days when David could call my bank pretending to be my concerned son-in-law were over permanently. Every financial institution I worked with was provided with detailed documentation about the fraud attempt and strict instructions about who was authorized to access information about my accounts. But the most devastating financial blow to David came through the civil lawsuit my attorney filed on my behalf. We weren't just seeking recovery of the money he'd stolen. We were pursuing damages for the systematic abuse, the emotional distress, and the attempted theft of my independence. The lawsuit targeted not just David personally, but also his business assets, his professional licenses, and his future earning capacity. The civil proceedings moved parallel to the criminal case, but with different rules and different objectives. While the criminal case focused on punishment and deterrence, the civil case was designed to ensure that David would never financially benefit from his crimes and would face ongoing consequences for years to come. We placed liens on his property, garnished his business accounts, and obtained court orders that would follow him even if he declared bankruptcy. The social strategy was equally important and perhaps more personally satisfying. David had built his scheme on his reputation as a trustworthy, caring family man. His success in manipulating me had depended on the respect and trust he'd cultivated within our community. Destroying that reputation became a key component of ensuring he couldn't victimize others. I began by methodically contacting everyone who might have been influenced by David's charm and apparent devotion to family. I spoke with his colleagues in the real estate industry, sharing documentation of his fraud and warning them about his methods. I contacted his clients, explaining how his apparent expertise in helping elderly clients had masked predatory intentions. I reached out to my neighbors and friends, many of whom had expressed admiration for David's attentiveness to my needs. The response was immediate and decisive. David's real estate firm terminated his employment within weeks of learning about the charges against him. His professional license was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case. Former clients began reviewing their own transactions with him, looking for signs of the manipulation he'd perfected in his personal life. But perhaps the most effective social consequence came from Emma and Jake themselves. As the custody proceedings unfolded and the children began to understand that Daddy had been mean to Grandma, they started asking questions that revealed how David had been coaching them to gather information about my routines, my visitors, and my conversations. The children's innocent revelations provided additional evidence of the systematic nature of David's surveillance and manipulation. The legal strategy focused on ensuring maximum consequences under both criminal and civil law. My attorney worked closely with the prosecutors to ensure that the criminal charges reflected the full scope of David's scheme, not just the individual incidents. Elder abuse statutes provided enhanced penalties, but only if the prosecution could demonstrate the systematic and predatory nature of his actions. The evidence we provided was overwhelming and undeniable. The digital trail David had left behind, the forged documents, the recorded conversations, and the testimony from the children created a case that his defense attorney couldn't realistically challenge. Rather than go to trial, David accepted a plea agreement that included significant jail time, full restitution, and a permanent restraining order that would prevent him from contacting me or attempting to access my property. But the most important element of my strategy was protecting Emma and Jake from the consequences of their parents' actions. The children were innocent victims of David's scheme, and I was determined that their futures wouldn't be destroyed by their father's greed and their mother's complicity. Working with Child Welfare Services and Family Court, we established a custody arrangement that removed the children from the toxic environment David and Sarah had created, while ensuring they could maintain a relationship with both parents under supervised conditions. Mark and I became their primary caregivers, providing stability and security while their parents dealt with the legal and personal consequences of their choices. The college funds I'd established for Emma and Jake were restructured as protected trusts that their parents couldn't access or influence. These funds would ensure that the children's educational opportunities wouldn't be compromised by their parents' financial problems or legal expenses. More importantly, the trusts included provisions for counseling and support services to help the children process the trauma of their family's destruction. The house itself became a symbol of my victory over David's manipulation. He'd researched its value, calculated its worth, and planned to gain control of it through legal guardianship. Instead, it became the foundation of a trust structure that would provide security for Mark and the grandchildren while remaining completely beyond David's reach forever. I made strategic improvements to the property that increased its value while also enhancing its security. A new alarm system, updated locks, and landscape changes that improved visibility and access control sent a clear message that this was no longer a house where manipulation and predation could flourish. The home where David had conducted his surveillance and planning became a fortress protecting the family he'd tried to destroy. The personal satisfaction of watching David's life unravel was tempered by sadness about Sarah's choices, but it didn't diminish my determination to see justice done completely. Every court hearing, every legal filing, and every consequence David faced served as validation that I'd been right to trust my instincts and fight back against his manipulation. But perhaps the most important aspect of my strategy was documentation and sharing. Throughout the process, I kept detailed records not just for legal purposes, but to create a resource that could help other potential victims recognize similar schemes. I worked with Elder Protection Services to develop educational materials based on David's methods, helping other older adults understand the warning signs of financial predation. The strategy succeeded beyond my expectations. David was sentenced to 4 years in prison, with additional years of supervised probation that included restrictions on his contact with elderly individuals. His real estate license was permanently revoked, and his business assets were liquidated to pay restitution and civil damages. Sarah lost custody of the children and faced her own legal consequences, though her cooperation in the prosecution earned her a more lenient sentence. Most importantly, the children were safe, my assets were protected, and the community was warned about the tactics that predators like David used to target vulnerable older adults. The man who had spent months planning my downfall had instead orchestrated his own destruction, while the woman he'd dismissed as a helpless victim had proven to be his most formidable opponent. 6 months after my confrontation with David on that screened porch, my life had been completely transformed, but not in the way he'd planned. Instead of becoming a confused, dependent elderly woman under his control, I'd emerged stronger, more confident, and more connected to my community than I'd been in years. The crisis had forced me to rediscover capabilities and strengths I'd forgotten I possessed, and the victory had given me a sense of purpose and accomplishment that retirement had been lacking. Emma and Jake adjusted to their new living arrangements with remarkable resilience. Children are often more adaptable than adults realize, and having the stability of Mark's presence and my continued involvement in their lives helped them process the difficult changes in their family structure. They continued to see Sarah under supervised visitation, but her relationship with them remained strained by her participation in David's scheme and her ongoing legal troubles. Mark proved to be an exceptional guardian and co-parent, stepping into responsibilities he'd never expected to have, but embracing them with the same integrity his father had always demonstrated. Watching him grow into this role provided me with enormous pride and reassurance about the family's future. The children were learning lessons about honesty, loyalty, and the consequences of betrayal that would serve them well throughout their lives. The house, which David had seen as an asset to be acquired, became a true family home in ways it hadn't been since Robert's death. Emma's artwork covered the refrigerator, Jake's toys filled the family room, and the sounds of children's laughter echoed through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. The home that had represented vulnerability and isolation became a symbol of family strength and protection. My relationship with the community changed significantly as word of my situation spread. Instead of being seen as the sweet, elderly widow who needed protection and assistance, I became known as the woman who'd fought back against elder abuse and won. Other older residents began coming to me for advice about their own family situations, their financial security, and their concerns about manipulation or fraud. This new role as an advocate and advisor gave me a sense of purpose that I'd been missing since Robert's death. I began volunteering with Elder Protection Services, sharing my experience to help others recognize the warning signs of financial predation, speaking at community centers, senior living facilities, and legal seminars about David's methods, and my response became a regular part of my schedule. The financial recovery exceeded our expectations. David's restitution payments, combined with the civil judgment and the liquidation of his assets, actually resulted in my recovering more money than he'd originally stolen. The additional damages awarded for emotional distress and the systematic nature of his abuse created a significant financial cushion, that further protected my independence and security. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. The confusion, fatigue, and uncertainty that had plagued me during the months leading up to my birthday disappeared completely once David's influence was removed from my life. Without his subtle undermining of my confidence and his interference with my medications, I felt sharper, more energetic, and more capable than I had in years. My doctor was amazed by the improvement in my mental clarity and physical health once the stress of David's manipulation was eliminated. The medical evaluation that David had arranged to support his guardianship plans instead provided evidence of my complete mental competency and physical capability. The cognitive decline he'd been reporting to medical professionals had been entirely artificial, created by his systematic interference with my medications and his psychological manipulation. The legal precedent set by David's case had implications beyond my personal situation. His conviction under elder abuse statutes with enhanced penalties sent a message to potential predators that targeting older adults would result in serious consequences. The case was studied by law enforcement agencies and elder protection services as an example of how financial predation schemes operate and how they can be successfully prosecuted. Sarah's situation remained more complicated and painful. While her cooperation with the prosecution had resulted in reduced legal penalties, the damage to our relationship seemed irreparable. Her choice to participate in David's scheme, even passively, represented a betrayal that went beyond money or property. She'd been willing to sacrifice my dignity, my independence, and my well-being for financial gain. And that betrayal cut deeper than any monetary theft. The supervised visitation arrangements allowed Sarah to maintain contact with Emma and Jake, but under conditions that protected both the children and me from further manipulation or abuse. Over time, it became clear that Sarah was struggling with the consequences of her choices and the dissolution of the life she'd built with David. While I felt sympathy for her situation, I couldn't allow that sympathy to compromise the safety and security we'd fought so hard to establish. The restraining orders against both David and Sarah remained in place, providing legal protection against any future attempts at contact or manipulation. David's imprisonment eliminated the immediate threat, but the legal framework we'd established would continue protecting us long after his eventual release. The trust structures, the security protocols, and the documentation we'd created formed a comprehensive shield against future predation. Emma and Jake's understanding of what had happened evolved as they grew older and could process more complex explanations. We were careful to present age-appropriate information that helped them understand why their family situation had changed without demonizing their parents or creating unnecessary trauma. The children learned valuable lessons about trust, honesty, and the importance of protecting vulnerable family members. Looking back on that terrible birthday discovery and the months of upheaval that followed, I realized that David had inadvertently given me an extraordinary gift. His betrayal had forced me to rediscover my own strength, to rebuild my support network, and to create a more secure and purposeful life than I'd had since Robert's death. The woman who emerged from that crisis was more confident, more connected, and more capable than the woman who'd been slowly disappearing under David's manipulation. The story that began with the devastating revelation of my family's betrayal ultimately became a story of triumph over adversity, of justice over exploitation, and of the enduring strength that can emerge when someone fights back against those who would take advantage of their vulnerability. David had planned to make me disappear, but instead, he'd helped me become more visible, more powerful, and more determined than ever before. Today, as I sit in the same kitchen where I first heard David's true feelings about me, I'm surrounded by evidence of the life I've rebuilt from the ashes of his deception. Emma's school photos smile at me from the refrigerator. Jake's soccer schedule is posted on the bulletin board. Mark's contact information is prominently displayed for any emergency services that might need it. And most importantly, David's name and influence have been completely erased from every aspect of my life and my family's future. The story you've just heard has been modified in names and places to protect the identities of the people involved. I don't share this to judge. but with the hope that someone listening will stop and think about how many mothers are suffering in silence within their own homes. I truly wonder, if you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have chosen silence to keep the peace, or would you have dared to face everything to reclaim your own voice? I want to know your opinion because every story can become a candle that lights the way for others. God always blesses us, and I'm certain that courage leads us to better days. Meanwhile, on the final screen, I'll leave you with two of the channel's favorite stories.